Media outlets focused on audiences of color have made big news recently. From the debut of Fusion, a channel aimed at Latino millennials from ABC and Univision, to former CNN contributor Roland Martin's African-American focused daily radio and TV shows on the TV One and Radio One networks. So how do these outlets deliver news differently from mainstream media sources? And is there anything the mainstream media can learn from them? Here to answer these questions is Ray Suarez, former anchor with PBS's NewsHour, now at Al Jazeera America, and Richard Prince, who covers news about journalists of color in his online column Journalisms at the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. So, Richard, those two media outlets that I mentioned have focused on telling news from a different cultural perspective. What does that look like, and how is it different than what we see in the mainstream news outlets?
Well, the first thing we see are that they are people of color who are the subjects of the news stories, and the content is of particular interest to people of color. For example, one of the biggest story in the last couple of weeks has been the Affordable Care Act. You would not know from most of the mainstream coverage that most African Americans, Latinos, are in favor of the Affordable Care Act. They're not the ones belly aching, but it's been presented as universally reviled by the general population. I don't think you'd find that among Latino and African American oriented shows.
Sense.
Yeah.
So Ray, you're headed to a new job at Al Jazeera America after years at the NewsHour. What are the various ways that mainstream news outlets can kind of miss the boat on coverage of people of color? And have you ever felt marginalized yourself as a person of color in a newsroom?
You're always in a difficult straddle, because there's an idea that there's a general, broad way to tell every story. And if you're going to look at something like the Affordable Care Act, which is also of a different level of interest to communities of color, just because of the profile of who's uninsured in America. Right. The most uninsured and underinsured of all Americans are Latinos. So maybe there's a different cut at the story that gets at the different interests at stake and the different views of how this is all going to affect them. Have I felt marginalized? Well, sometimes, only because, and not because of an active bias or marginalization, as much as a kind of myopia that looks at these stories and says, well, there's one way to tell them, and that's to your average American, who doesn't look like me or Richard, or you for that matter. And it's that privilege of being the decider who says, this is how we tell this story, that has very little black and brown input into it. And so it's a tough one. It's a tough one. We're trying to get into a business that is right now deciding what its business model is going to be and has been shrinking for the last 10 years. So it's a tough time.
Yeah, now Ray, I saw an interview you did with the Wrap website where you sort of talked about feeling like you didn't have access to that kind of decision-making ability at the NewsHour anymore. So could you talk a little bit about how you felt there? I mean, some of the executives there have said that they plan to make you chief national correspondent and you might have more latitude, but talk about that and talk about how you might have that freedom at Al Jazeera America with this new show that you have coming out.
Well, I go on the air tomorrow, so I hope some of your viewers tune in. 5 o'clock Eastern, live across all time zones. Show's called Inside Story. And just by moving from being a correspondent to being a host is a tremendous step up in the influence into the editorial product. When we have a meeting, I'm one of the most heard voices in that meeting, because guess what? People want to keep the anchor man happy, and
yeah, I've discovered that.
And you're chosen because the people who hired you think that the way you look at the news is worth paying for and worth hiring. So it already means a big step up for me. I'm very excited. Can't wait to get started.
Sounds good. Now, Richard, we don't have a lot of time, but one question that people always bring up is, where is the line between fairly depicting people of color and being an unfair advocate in the news for people of color and their concerns? So how do you draw the line between actually being fair or having your finger on the scale?
Well, I think I'll answer that by talking about a survey that Essence magazine just conducted among black women, and in which they asked how did they think they were being betrayed by the media. And the categories that they came up with were gold diggers, modern Jezebels, baby mamas, uneducated sisters, ratchet women, angry black women, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. I think that there's no the shows that seem to resonate among mainstream audiences that concern African American women, particularly, can't be described as fair in their representation of how African American women actually are.
All right. Well, Richard and Ray, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me.